Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our talk today that forms part of the CAPTURE series. Thank you so much, Lisa, for the kind introductions, and thanks very much for inviting us to talk about our research today. So we are here to talk about the digitisation of scientific research. We're going to cover some of the barriers to digitisation and some of the technologies that can be utilised to try and maximise the benefits of digitisation. So as Lisa covered, I'm Dr. Samantha Kanza. I'm an Enterprise Research Fellow at the University of Southampton. I coordinate the AI3SD network, and I also work on a number of different research projects, mostly in the area of semantic web technologies. My initial background was computer science, which is where I absolutely fell in love with the semantic web. And when I came back to university to do my PhD, I really wanted to find a domain to apply my technical skills to. And I discovered Professor Jeremy Frey and the work that he had done with the semantic web and chemistry and electronic lab notebooks, and I was absolutely hooked. I think there is so much potential in these technologies, and I'm really looking forward to us sharing that with you today.
And I'm Dr. Nicola Knight. I'm also an Enterprise Research Fellow at the University of Southampton, which is where I coordinate activities on the Physical Sciences Data Science Service, which is one of our national research facilities. So my background is in chemistry, where I have a master's degree and also a PhD. During my PhD, I researched into the collection and use of chemical data and the move from the solely physical lab into the world of the digital lab. And these are some of the interconnected strands of data management that all feed into the work that we are presenting today. So I'm going to give a little outline about what we're going to cover in this talk. We've got quite a long session today, so we're going to cover quite a lot of content. Given our backgrounds and our jobs currently, a lot of our examples do actually come from the physical sciences, but most of them are still highly applicable across different domains. So there are many different aspects in the research data life cycle, and I'm sure we could very easily present on an hour on each of the individual topics. But today we're going to cover the digitization of scientific research from two different angles. So we're going to talk about getting the data into digital formats and what can be done with this data once in the digital formats to improve its usability and the value that can be extracted from it. So we're going to start by setting the scene, talking about the traditional collection and storage of the scientific research data and what some of these barriers are to the adoption of digital technologies, both in terms of the technical barriers, but also very importantly, some of the social barriers to adoption. We're going to then look at some of the ways in which these issues might be mitigated to enable data collection in a digital format, including different hardware that can be used at the point of collection. In the second part of the talk, we're going to examine what we can do once we have digitally. Doesn't mean that all of those problems have magically been fixed and that the data can then be easily explored. We're going to focus a portion of this talk on an introduction to the semantic web and how data can be enhanced through the use of semantic technologies, including some examples of work we have done using the semantic web in scientific research projects. And then we will round up with some discussion on the lessons that have been learned throughout our research and where we are looking to in our future research. Oh.
So in terms of scientific record keeping, this isn't a new phenomena. People have been making scientific records for a really long time to allow them to make discoveries and to disseminate their findings. Typically, this has always been done using the paper lab notebook. And to be honest, this hasn't really significantly changed over the years. In many labs today, it's still very common to find that a lot of the notes are taken using paper lab notebooks. Unfortunately, this means that a lot of research effort is currently wasted or underutilized due to these inefficiencies in the research system. And this is estimated at billions of dollars a year in health research alone. There's a myriad of reasons for this wastage, but some of it is due to inaccessible, poorly documented work, which leads to duplication of research, unpublished work, and research that is sadly not reproducible. Whilst digitization isn't a magic wand to solve all of these problems, well-implemented systems could help streamline the research processes. Although digital technologies have become commonplace in almost every other aspect of our lives, sadly, the research lab is one area which has still been really slow to adopt these technologies. But we are hopeful that the tide is now changing as people realise that some of the benefits that can be gained from well-implemented systems. It's also worth noting that there is a lot more to scientific research data than what is currently captured in lab notebooks. Whilst we are going to be focusing mainly on that type of data as part of our discussions today, It's important to remember that there are lots of other different types of scientific research data. So there's experiment plans that you'll make before you go into the laboratory. There's the observations and notes that you'll typically will end up in your paper lab notebook because you'll be doing them in the lab during your experiment. However, you're often collecting data from instruments as part of your work as well, and that data is much more likely to be in an electronic form in the beginning, as instruments in the lab are now often hooked up to computers, so they automatically produce electronic versions of these data readings. And there's also other documents that are associated with scientific research, so such as COSH forms. These look at the hazards and risks associated with an experiment. They also have inventories that need to be kept up to date. So typically there will be some records of materials and chemicals that you use that you need to log, so people know when the stores are getting low. And then you get results based on the data analysis. So typically those are also generated and edited electronically because you've started with your data in an electronic format in the first place. And then ultimately you're going to probably produce papers and so that's a lot of diverse data sources, some paper, some electronic, and all coming from different places. And to have this myriad of different data sources really requires good knowledge management for us to be able to manage this in an efficient way. So as you can see from the wide spectrum of data, the idea of digitizing scientific research in a way that is useful is a really, really big task, and it isn't one that's possible to do all in one go. There are aspects surrounding getting the data into a digital format in the first place, as a lot of data still isn't in a digital form. And as Nikki said, even once you get it into a digital format, there is a huge amount of work to be done on how that digital data can then be accessed, worked with, and interrogated to increase the value that you can get out of it. So firstly, we're going to talk about the digitization process, and then we're going to talk about how to produce good machine readable data and demonstrate some of our work in both these areas. So this idea of handling this process one step at a time is especially important in existing projects where you might already have a data collection method in place, or you might already actually have your data. And when you're starting a new research project, it's very important to start out with good plans for data collection and management so that you don't have to come back and significantly rework your data at a later stage.
So we're going to talk about why digitizing your work is important and discuss some of the different solutions that can be used to help with the digitization process. For the purposes of this talk and the time we have available, we're going to be focusing mainly on the digitization of scientific research that would be traditionally found in the lab notebook. The first aspect is actually the argument as to whether one should digitize or not. Paper, after all, does have many advantages, such as the portability, convenience, and flexibility, which has made it so popular in scientific recording. But it also does have many disadvantages in terms of searching and accessing data later, or actually adding value to the scientific on paper. In fact, there are many potential negative outcomes that can arise from solely keeping paper records. So in this cartoon, it actually depicts a few of the scenarios that might arise with paper notebooks. So we have search and retrieval. In this case, maybe realizing later down the line that there was a problem with previous data and trying to go back and find the related notes and records around that. This can be very tricky or even impossible to do if your records aren't stored well. And even if they are stored in a nice ordered fashion, it can be exceptionally time consuming. We also have the potential of destruction. So paper can be very easily destroyed by fire or other factors, and it can be more tricky to create a backup, without which all records may actually be lost. And then we also have access to notes. So if a researcher is potentially taken ill or in some other way incapacitated, then it might not necessarily be possible. The last 18 months have also added additional complications to accessing and sharing your research notes and data. So during the COVID-19 restrictions, many researchers have had to work remotely, or if they have actually been able to go into the lab, they haven't simply been able to work closely with their fellow researchers. In the past, you may have been able to hand over your lab notebook to your supervisor to ask them to look over it and make comments. But during COVID, this just wasn't possible. In fact, the COVID restrictions in many places have actually accelerated the move towards digital solutions for data storage and access to allow the researchers to access data remotely. But one key question is, have these solutions actually been implemented adequately, or has this implementation been rushed due to the circumstances we found ourselves in? And will this cause us lots of problems further down the road? So one of the early solutions developed to try and facilitate the digitization of scientific research was the electronic lab notebook. So electronic lab notebooks were initially created as a replacement for the paper lab notebook, with some of their features replicating features of the paper lab notebook, such as easy experiment storage and notation, but some also providing enhanced functionality that simply wouldn't be possible in paper. In particular, facilitating reproducibility, searchability, and enhanced availability of experiment records across multiple devices. They provide one location for all of your experimental records, and this means that your scientific data can easily be accessed, backed up, and shared with other scientists. So this sounds pretty good, right? So surely all scientists are just now using ELNs.
So unfortunately not. It is really obvious that there are some clear advantages to digitising scientific notes, and yet, unfortunately, using ELNs is still not commonplace in the scientific laboratory, especially in academia where the use of ELNs aren't enforced at all. So we're going to look at some of the reasons for why these have not been widely adopted and how we might think about trying to overcome them. So let's talk about ELNs to start with. The first half of my PhD was actually spent investigating ELNs and trying to understand current note-taking practices in the lab and why, despite the overwhelming number of ELN offerings out there, why they still weren't popular. As a computer scientist by background, it seemed absolutely crazy to me that so much work was conducted on paper, even now, and I wanted to understand what the issues were and whether there were any viable technology solutions. It became clear very quickly that this was not something that could just be fixed overnight, and this was as much a human issue as a technology issue. So one key issue is that the ELN market is somewhat oversaturated, and there is no obvious subset of key players in the same way that there is for generic note-taking software, which has arguably been cornered by Microsoft, Google, of diversity within the scientific domains. So just chemistry by itself has so many subdisciplines, and they all have quite different requirements. So what would be useful for a crystallographer wouldn't necessarily be useful for an organic chemist. And this has then led to various subject-specific ELNs being created, but also for people to try and create generic ELNs that could be used across multiple disciplines. But unfortunately, neither approach seems to have worked that well. Either it's too niche or it just doesn't quite cover the distinct criteria that certain subdisciplines need. And unfortunately, despite the advantages that counter the issues of paper that we've just discussed, there are many other barriers as to why ELNs haven't had a huge uptake. So these are some of the software-based barriers that are identified during various user studies. So the first one is accessibility. So whether you can actually use them in and out of the lab, particularly if there isn't space in the lab for you to actually use them in the first place, or how difficult it is to use them in the lab. There's general ease of use in that they're just not as easy to use as paper. It's often much less flexible to actually enter your data and much harder to create a diagram. Cost is a big one. People don't necessarily want to pay. There's often restricted budgets. If your university doesn't have a specific license for one, you're probably not going to get one. There's also data portability. So actually, we all use multiple devices. We have computers at home, computers at work, smartphones. Do we actually have the capacity to move the data between these? Probably not. And we also run the risk that once we've got it in a format, we might not be able to get it out of that format to use on another device. And then there's integration and compatibility. So is it even going to be available on the operating system or device you want to use? And will it continue to be compatible as it gets updated? There's also a number of environmental or situational reasons why an electronic system isn't always adopted. So the lab environment is an area that can be really hazardous. It's got a wide variety of potentially dangerous chemicals in it, and there's a high possibility of cross-contamination. So due to this, scientists typically wear gloves, which then produces further barriers to quickly taking notes on a laptop if you have to take off your gloves each time. So something one of my students said to me in one of the focus groups was, I don't even necessarily want to pick up a pen because that is too much effort. So actually then taking your gloves off is a whole new level of effort that people just don't want to do if they're mid-experiment. And the lab can also contain equipment that may be quite hostile to electronic devices, such as strong magnetic fields, where if you take your computer too close, it might just wipe your hard drive, and nobody wants that. There's often also little space for additional equipment to be moved in and out of the lab. So some of them are quite crowded. There isn't necessarily desk space to put a computer down or to be sure that it might actually be safe there. And the equipment that's present in the lab is often specialised for specific data collection, or it might be an isolated system without any network access, either because there isn't internet in the lab or because it's an aging system and they don't want to hook it up to the internet in case there's virus concerns. And also when you undertake work in a remote area, so either on site or actually out in the field, there might not be internet access and there might not be power, and then relying on an electronic system isn't going to work. There's also some other adoption barriers beyond the hardware and software that we've already mentioned. So in fact, some of the more complex issues are actually the human barriers to using ELNs. I spoke to a lot of different scientists when I was conducting my PhD research about why they didn't want to use ELNs or why they weren't at least digitising their work in some sort of fashion. Some said they did understand why it was good, but they were already most of the way through their PhD and they didn't want to change how they were doing things. Others were quite clearly influenced by their supervisors. So ones who had supervisors who were pro ELNs, although maybe I fall into that because mine obviously was, didn't support their usage. And they tended to follow their supervisor's lead on that, which both demonstrates how important it is to catch researchers early, so they maybe get into those habits before starting a PhD, but also how it's, you know, the responsibility of the supervisor to try and promote this as well. Some of the other students also said they felt their lab notebook was just a very personal space and they didn't necessarily want to write all of their notes into a more structured format of an ELN compared to the free flow of a notebook that also potentially only you and your supervisor are going to see. And finally, there's also a huge stigma attached with formally recording experiments that didn't work, where anyone else might potentially see them. And this is a huge issue that the scientific community really needs to change their attitude towards.
So we've seen that there are a wide range of barriers to the adoption of ELN products in scientific research. So I'm just going to go through some of the other potential solutions that might be adopted that could bring some of the benefits of digitisation whilst overcoming some of these barriers. So from our own experiences and also previous studies that we've undertaken, it is clear that the handwritten notation still has a really big place in scientific research, both as an input method for data, but also as a place to capture ideas that are currently not easily captured in sort of fixed ELN systems. We really think it's necessary to stop thinking about an ELN as just a single system that can directly replace the paper lab, as it currently isn't able to do that. But instead, we need to look towards integrating several different solutions to enable researchers to capture the different aspects of their work and then be able to bring them together. So in addition to purely digital systems that primarily use the keyboard or a tablet as their mode of input, there have been significant developments in recent years in hybrid systems. So these are a combination of pen input and then digital storage. So a lot of these are a lot more similar to the traditional paper systems that researchers are used to. And there are several different style systems available or being developed in this area. So the main structures for these are sort of handwriting recognition combined with scanning technologies. So capturing information written in pen and then converting it to a digital format, either as an image or containing optical character recognition, so OCR, which will then allow manipulation in the digital form. Alternatively, you can have e-ink devices where notes and sketches can be made with a stylus or a smart pen directly into a digital format. And again, these might have some level of OCR associated with them. So these hybrid devices are a lot less restrictive in the content that can be included with them, allowing sort of sketches and notations along with a combination of tables, lists and text, etc., in a way that's still very portable, but much better in terms of searching and backup. However, while a human view, it is often difficult for a computer to understand the content and context in many cases with this. This scroll wheel. In addition to work on replacing paper as the input method for data, another area of increasing interest is in smart labs and smart instrumentation. So this is where the laboratory itself is significantly more connected and actually collects and interacts with some of the data itself, rather than having the researcher sort of interacting between it. So at Southampton, we run a project called Talk to Lab. So this is a Frey Group initiative and was a considerable part of the work as part of my PhD. So Talk to Lab is a prototype lab environment in one of our physics laser labs, where we integrate sensors to monitor many aspects of the lab, which includes the environmental and also experimental parameters. And then we can access this data either remotely on computers via interactive dashboards in the lab, and also quite importantly through a voice interface layer, which provides some hands-free access to information. So instead of the scientists recording specific measurements directly into their lab book, they are automatically captured by the lab environment. So this project is currently quite passive in terms of monitoring and retrieving data, but there is potential to expand this functionality to connect other aspects of the laboratory data, such as health and safety, or chemicals that could really help you. We've also started mapping the data structures present in the lab environment, but some of the aspects of semantic web technologies, which we'll cover later in this talk, will be very useful in helping us model our data consistently. And eventually we'd like to link a semantic layer to make much more complex queries over our data. Another member of our team has also been working on automated methods for digitizing paper-based research. So there's a lot of valuable scientific research that is currently just sitting on shelves in paper lab notebooks, but digitizing that all manually would be very, very labor intensive. Research is often even repeated because you can't find the initial records. So researchers, including our colleague Samuel Monday, are working on automated solutions for this that involve scanning in the work and performing OCR on it, which can automatically translate it into the digital text. And then this electronic text can be analyzed and metadata added to it to enable you to much more easily get understanding and search through it. So this will go a long way to helping us digitize the huge amount of allow us to gain more scientific insights. So despite many of the issues that still remain, there has been progress in the area of digitizing scientific research. Most significantly, universities have started to recognize that students need to use ELNs or other software to record not just data, but also their notes. So several universities have run pilot studies to trial mass implementations of lab notebooks across their systems, such as Cambridge in 2017, who trialed several systems, so RSpace, Lab Archives, Sino, and the Open Science Framework, and also the University of Edinburgh, who ran a trial in 2019. Also, many universities have prepared guidance on choosing notebooks and why to use them, which shows they're starting to understand the importance of promoting this among their students. And it's really important, as often academia is quite a lot freer. So whereas industries might mandate specific ELNs, in the universities, it's nice to have the freedom, but it's important to encourage the further digitization. So there have also been a lot more generic pieces of software that have come up as considerations for ELNs. So they might lack in some of the main domain knowledge that we might expect from an ELN, but their notebooking capabilities are really quite fantastic. And some of the features, such as typing in data, spell checking, and organizing different pages, are arguably better than in some of the ELN counterparts. So that might fit some of your requirements for simply just typing up notes. And importantly, the device costs have come down quite significantly. So where people might previously have not been able to purchase a smartphone or a tablet purely for using for an ELN system, nowadays they're much more affordable. And while researchers might be reluctant to take laptops into the lab, it's much more common for them to be able to take a small device, such as a smartphone, inside, and then they can take photos or note down important information that can be synced to a computer. So what can we conclude from some of these solutions? So we still aren't at a stage where scientists are willing to fully abandon paper, as there are a myriad of barriers, including hardware, software, and societal. But we have found that ELNs are still primarily received as a replacement to, rather than a supplement to, the paper lab notebook. So this is important because we need to understand the different problems and stages at stake here. So getting scientists to digitize their work in the first place is one issue. However, managing your research once it is in the electronic form is a different matter. And importantly, a reluctance to use the actual ELNs isn't necessarily a reluctance to engage with the technology of managing the work once it is in an electronic form. However, there is to improve our software offerings and, just as importantly, change our attitudes towards what we are willing to digitize and the methods that we are using. We also think that other interaction methods, such as voice, have the potential to really impact the laboratory environment as these systems become better developed. Now, as we mentioned, getting data into the digital format is only part of the story. Once we do have the digital data, what actually comes next? It is important to point out that being digital doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. Getting your data into the digital format is only one hurdle. And if it is poor quality, so messy data, scrambled, poorly labeled, then it's going to be hard to use regardless of its format. Having a spreadsheet might be great, but if you don't know what the columns are, what the units are, or what it's actually referring to, then how can you be expected to get any insight from it? It also might not be in a reusable format. So pictures of notes are arguably an electronic form of data. However, that doesn't actually make them easily usable in a digital system. And if your data isn't machine readable, then it's not particularly much more use to your computer than it actually being on paper. So there is a lot of electronic data out there that isn't particularly useful, either due to its quality or its nature. And this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So one set of guidelines that are aiming to address some of these issues in data reusability are the FAIR data principles. So these are a set of principles that aim to improve your scientific data management. Once you have your data in a digital format, ideally you should aim to make it FAIR. So FAIR stands for findable, which denotes that people and computers should be able to find your data. Accessible, which means that anybody should be able to access and retrieve your data. Interoperable, which means putting it in an open and machine readable format that can also be used in conjunction with other data sources. And reusable, which means that it should have sufficient metadata to describe it such that other researchers can understand it and also make use of it.
So obviously, making our data fair is quite an undertaking. And for the purposes of this talk, we're going to focus specifically on the I from fair, being interoperable, which is arguably the most complicated bit. And we're going to talk about how we can make our data machine readable. So for data to be machine readable, it needs to be stored in a machine readable format whereby software agents can access and process it without human intervention. There are several different standards for machine readable data. An older one, which might be familiar to you all, is XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language. And of course, there's HTML, the hypertext markup language, which is used to mark up web pages. And both of these enable data to be marked up such that it can be read and manipulated by software. However, whilst data in this, and really, we want data that computers can understand and derive meaning from. And this is where the semantic web comes in. So let's talk about the wonderful world of the semantic web. What is the semantic web? The semantic web was conceptualized by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the man who invented our World Wide Web. The main goal of the semantic web was to create machine readable data such that machines could better interpret information. So our language is really complex and words can have different meanings in different contexts, even if they're spelled exactly the same. And humans are really good at picking up on this context and meaning, and we do it automatically without thinking. So take reading and reading as an example. You're just going to know which is which because of the context, but a computer won't. The semantic web provides a set of core standards to facilitate rich modeling of our data, such that we can actually provide this context and meaning, and we can specify that we mean reading the city or reading the activity. The core data format of the semantic web is called Resource Description Framework, or RDF for short. So this uses a graph model to store the data in triples of a subject, predicate, and object, whereby the predicate defines the relationship between the subject and the object. Triples can then be linked together by making the object of one triple the subject of another, which enables us to break down data sets into this linked data format. So I'd put a simplistic view of a triple on the previous slide, but in reality, the subject, predicate, and objects are often formed of persistent identifiers, aka a URI, which stands for Unique Resource Identifier, which means that once you define a term, you can reuse that URI to refer to it again. So in this instance, a URI can be defined for a specific drug and a specific disease, and anyone who then wants to refer to those specific things can reuse that URI. And you can have other things in your triples as well. So you can have things such as text and integers, which we can do with a thing called XSD data types, or you can have blank nodes as well, depending on your design. So RDF supports storing the data in this link graph format, but it is not sufficient enough by itself to represent the required domain knowledge that provides the context and the meaning behind the data. In order to achieve this, we need ontologies. So I personally like to think of an ontology as basically a fancy taxonomy with logic behind it, or they can be thought of as controlled vocabularies or dictionaries, but essentially it all boils down to a very similar description. Ontologies allow us to create formal definitions of the common terms used within a specific domain. And they essentially allow us to describe the hierarchy of the classes used to define the relationships and restrictions of different concepts within this domain. And by doing this, reusable terms can be built up for use within other systems that also employ the same terminology. Ontologies are typically written in OWL, which is the web ontology language, as it has substantially more expressive capabilities, but you can also write simple ontologies in RDFS, which stands for RDF schema. In RDF with ontologies, we get knowledge graphs. There are a lot of fancy, slightly different definitions for knowledge graphs, but one that I quite like is knowledge graphs are essentially graph network structures to describe real-world entities and their relationships through the combination of linked data and ontologies. And it's that combination of linked data and ontologies that is really the key. So if you want to turn a data set into a knowledge graph, you need to have an ontology or set of ontologies to represent your domain knowledge. And then you can mark up your data in a linked data form using the objects and relationships defined in your ontologies. And then you essentially have a knowledge graph. Now, we know that big companies like Google have their own knowledge graphs, and no doubt there are many other companies creating what they might term as enhanced knowledge graphs. But depending on the complexity and reasoning of the ontologies you've used, obviously there could be different scopes to your knowledge graphs, but at their base form, it is just that combination of RDF and ontologies. Ultimately, these graphs of linked entities have the potential to be really powerful structures. And researchers working on machine learning and AI have also realized that using them can enable the application of advanced learning techniques on the data because it can exploit the network of links. So, as noted in the previous slide, there are formats for marking up your entire data set in RDF to make it a fully linked data set, but that might not always be what you want to do. You may just wish to annotate your documents with semantic metadata. So there are 3 different formats for semantic annotation, which are RDFA, JSON-LD, so that's the JavaScript linked data, and microdata. And all of these can be embedded within HTML documents. And this will enable search engines such as Google to run much more accurate, comprehensive results when indexing your websites. So we have a data format and we have ways of defining the terms of our data. And now we need to be able to search it. So Sparkle is a semantic web query language. It's based on SQL, and it has a similar structure of selecting, inserting, and deleting, except in a graph form this time rather than a tabular database form. The beauty of Sparkle is it allows you to search on concepts, so you can actually add context to your search. So as you can see from the query example on the slide, this query is searching for a laboratory that has a specific piece of equipment by defining the relationships that all need to be in place for a laboratory to fit that criteria of the query.
So now you've had a quick introduction to what the semantic web is, and now I'm going to talk you through some of the different use cases that can be had with semantic web technologies and the benefits that these might bring about. So the first one is defining a shared language, so that you can be absolutely sure that what you're talking about is actually the same thing. So interestingly, Sammy is currently leading an ethics working group as part of working and looking at digital collaboration about food. So one of the things that they discovered early on is that when they were talking about terms related to ethics and AI, even though they agreed in principle on the common terms that they needed to be thinking about, so e.g. transparency, explainability, accessibility, they quickly realized that these words meant vastly different things across the different domains. So in computer science, transparency could refer to whether an algorithm is available and understandable, but in the food sector, this might refer to having access to information about the provenance of your food. So this really highlights the importance of defining your concepts and knowing whether you are talking actually about the same thing. So as the same words, so even when you're talking about the same topic, in this case, ethics, can actually be defined differently within different contexts and different disciplines. So then we have making your data machine readable and also understandable. After all, if your computers can't actually understand your data, then they aren't going to be able to do very much with it. Making your data machine readable vastly opens up its potential to be used in different applications, as machines are much, much more powerful at analyzing data. However, one of the key comments that comes up at every single one of our workshops is this issue of data quality. So humans struggle with poor quality data, but so do machines. You wouldn't necessarily expect a human to effectively handle data of a very poor quality, and you can't simply expect the machine to either. You can also produce rich interoperable metadata, which makes it much easier to search web pages and documents. As Sammy mentioned, you can also mark up text, and this will allow you to know that you're talking about the same thing. This is particularly useful in things like electronic lab notebooks, which Sammy will touch on later, and it allows you to mark up relevant terms to make it easier to link documents together and search across them. Semantic web technologies can also be used for linking data together. So scientific research is really very complex, and there are so often research questions that are not answered with a single data set. However, combining these data sets together can allow you to find undiscovered links. This is particularly useful in domains such as like drug discovery, where it's very common to require multiple data sets to be linked. And the next advantage that you get from the semantic web is inferencing. So we are able to add description logic to ontologies, and then we can set the domains and the ranges of these relationships and apply different restrictions to them. Once we have that, we can then run a reasoner, and we can obtain new information that wasn't explicitly defined within the initial data, but instead it can be inferred. So a simple example of this is if we know that Sammy is allergic to juniper, and if we also know that gin has the botanical of juniper, we can infer the additional information that Sammy is allergic to gin. She is very glad, though, that this isn't a true example, but this concept is very useful to be able to produce additional information and explore the data set relationships. And as noted earlier, we can search on the concepts rather than on the specific text. And we can search across all of the data sets that we have linked together. So Sparkle can be used to make much more powerful, complex queries over these combined data sets, which allows you to pull out new, unexplored connections. So I believe that semantics will play a really massive part in allowing us to unlock the potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning. However, we all know the saying, garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how beautiful your algorithm is. If you're giving it garbage data, you won't get any good results. Instead, feeding your algorithm beautifully semantically rich data has a much greater potential for discovering new insights.
Okay, so I'm now just going to run through some of our work in the semantic web space, and then Nikki's going to tell you about some of our other data related. So the first project I want to talk to you about is my PhD research, which focused on digitizing scientific research and semantically marking it up. So as I mentioned earlier, I investigated ELNs and current note-taking practices in the first half of my PhD, and I found that despite various hardware, software, and social barriers, ultimately some scientific research is being digitized. And whilst we obviously need to focus on increasing digitization, we also need to focus on providing a better environment for the work that is already digitized. So this line of investigation led me to the diagram on the right, which shows the breakdown of a layered semantic laboratory notebook. So through a thorough literature investigation and many interviews and focus groups with different types of scientists, this diagram shows the different functionality aspects that scientists would want to find in an electronic lab notebook. So this has been broken down into layers. A majority of the generic functionality desired, so secure backup, cloud access, and all the generic notebooking features, can be provided already by a cloud notebook platform. So this forms the notebook layer, so the bottom square. The second layer represents the domain-specific knowledge required that could be added onto this rather than reinventing the wheel and creating the notebook part from scratch, especially as you would want very different types of domain knowledge to be added on depending on your subdiscipline of your science. The semantic layer then details the knowledge management tools that are required. So semantic web technologies can be used to mark up the data with meaning and context, as I said, to facilitate more intelligent search, different domain-based add-ons for different disciplines, and then you could have different ontologies and different semantic data sets used within the semantic layer. So you'd start off with all your generic features that everybody wants, and then you would custom build the layers on top for your specific discipline. So a lot of the conversations I had with scientists suggested that they are missing overall knowledge management. And as we just discussed, the semantic web gives a lot of affordances for this, such as facilitating links between related documents and ensuring that you are talking about the same thing, as that's really important because there are quite a few words that get used between different scientific disciplines that also mean different things depending on the context. And you want to be able to search over those specific contexts rather than just text, so you know that you're talking about the same thing. I think this search aspect is really, really key because that is just objectively something a computer can do so much better and so much faster than a human, and even better once you factor in the capabilities of semantic search. Back one more. So that was the first half of my PhD. And having ascertained that a semantic layer approach could be useful, I wanted to investigate this in practice, as it's one thing for people to tell you what they want as abstract concepts, but without giving them something tangible to consider, it's hard to move into a concrete approach. So I designed a very rough web tool called Semantic Cat, which definitely stands for semantic catalog and has nothing to do with my cat obsession. This is a tool to pull in documents and mark them up using some ontologies and a few different semantic tagging services, both generic ones and some chemistry specific ones to cover the requirements of tagging documents, linking to ontologies and automatically recognizing chemicals. This was used as a discussion tool in my focus groups to try and understand what scientists actually wanted from semantic tagging and searching, and the results were quite interesting. So as noted in my previous slide, many scientists feel that they are missing good knowledge management. So even though they don't necessarily want to use an ELN, that doesn't mean they don't want to use a tool that makes their knowledge management easier. And therefore, in some instances, it might be that having this standalone semantic layer to help with your knowledge management, so linking between related documents, tagging, marking up, might actually be more useful than it needing to be part of a formal ELN. Another key obvious that tagging and searching through a scientist's work is also a very personal endeavour, which is not surprising because we already know that note-taking in itself is also very personal. But this does suggest that still, as we said earlier, a one-size approach does not fit all. Tagging and searching offerings need to be customizable. However, obviously there also needs to be a level of automation, because if you ask the scientists to do it all themselves, they're probably not going to. But they also need to be able to change things, because if it gets it wrong, then they're just going to dismiss. But you've got options for correction and customization, ideally with a technology that could actually learn from these changes, so it'll get better as time goes on. And thirdly, there was feedback that potentially some tags and annotations might be more useful for reading others' work than your own. As chances are you actually know your own work really well, but if you were reading somebody else's work, you might actually want that additional information. But either way, you would still want the underlying metadata to be there for searching. So obviously there were many more findings, and if you're interested, my thesis is available online, but these are the key ones related to semantic tagging. So I just also wanted to mention another project I've been involved with, which is the first phase of the SEED project with Pistoia. So SEED stands for Semantic Enrichment of ELN Data, and obviously I jumped at the chance to get involved in this project as this very much fits my area of interest. and they are actually working towards producing a semantic layer for ELNs. But one of the reasons I wanted to mention it, alongside its obvious relation to this area, is because it demonstrates how much work needs to go into a semantic project. So for this project, the team narrowed down the area they were going to focus on, which was ADME, PICI, PD data, and then they started to try and find related ontologies. And as is often the case, a lot of the information that they actually wanted to represent semantically wasn't in existing ontologies. So the first bit of work that had to be done was to semantically model the types of terms that they wanted. And then this was done, thankfully, in an interoperable fashion, as they actually sensibly produced terms to align with the bioassay ontology, rather than just starting out completely from scratch. And these terms are actually now going to be incorporated into this ontology, which will now serve as an extension to it. And this project is now onto its second phase to actually start producing the tool, now that it's got some of the semantic models in place. So there's often so many stages to the type of work, and it's really important that the groundwork is done before rushing into prototypes, but also that it's done in an interoperable way that helps the rest of the semantic community, rather than just striking out on your own with no way to align it with other existing projects. But also, from the enthusiasm and involvement of so many different industrial and academic contacts in this project, it seems clear that both individual researchers, academia and industry all recognise that need for better knowledge management, even if we don't have a full solution yet.
So alongside some of the research projects that we've been involved in, a key part of our projects is education and raising awareness of these issues within the research community. And we've actually run several series of events as part of our network activities. So one of these series that we ran was the Failed It to Nailed It event series, which took place in late 2020 as a collaboration with the Cell Press Journal of Patterns. So this event series actually followed on from a data sharing survey that we ran early in 2020, and we designed it to focus on 4 of the key aspects of the data management, data standards and guidelines, the legal and ethical angles of responsible data management, and data citations and publishing. So we think it's really important that researchers have an understanding of the different aspects involved in handling data, and also just sort of beyond what they would be doing, just recording their results from their scientific experiments. So this actually empowers them to create better structured data and should aid them in disseminating their research findings. So this event series has now completed, but we have captured outputs from this event series in the form of both video recordings and event reports. And these are all available on our website. And we'll just put the link to that into the chat where I can find it. There we go. And so another event series, I can get PowerPoint to work. Another event series that we also designed and ran was the Skills for Scientists program that we ran this summer. And we aimed through this program to educate scientists on a variety of different skills that would help them to become a fully well-rounded researcher. So this was primarily focused at the range of researchers from undergraduate level through postgraduate to the early career researcher. And this included sessions on research data management, how to write good code and version control it, and how to manage your research collaboratively. So this series in itself focused more on the hands-on skills that researchers could employ to allow them to more effectively manage and communicate their research. This series has actually just recently concluded a few weeks ago with a poster symposium where the students presented their research from the summer and demonstrated several of the skills that we included over the summer workshop series. Again, we captured the output from this event in this form of videos to enable us to reach a wider audience, and we now currently have a 25 video series published on our YouTube channel, and I'll put that website link into the chat as well.
So working on this range of projects has given us an immense amount of insight into the different aspects of digitalization and the use of semantic web technologies and general data management as well. So we're now going to share some of those lessons with you that we've learned along the way. So firstly, we learned a lot about attitudes to digitization. So despite all of the issues, scientists are digitizing at least part of their research. potentially more so since COVID and the pushes from their institutions to do so. However, we really need to address the stigmatism associated with publishing failed experiments. So scientists are much more reluctant to publish things that didn't work, but that's such a shame. And if researchers don't publish their unsuccessful work, then it generates a much greater risk that this work will just get repeated because there isn't any information out there on it. Secondly, it's clear that scientists are still, unfortunately, quite attached to their paper lab notebooks, and they don't necessarily think they'll be able to incorporate an ELN into their workflow easily, which means that we need to think about changing this workflow, and indeed thinking about how to make laboratories more conducive to recording notes. So this could potentially be through the use of voice or hybrid notebook products, which are both areas we're continuing to work on and investigate. And finally, this is as much a human endeavour as a software and hardware one. We really need an attitude shift that puts much more of a focus on ensuring that work does actually get digitised in the first place. In terms of data management, we learned a hell of a lot, both from our own projects and from running the Failed It to Nailed It and Skills for Scientists courses. A really key lesson is that managing your data and your software resources is even more important now that we've all been working remotely, because there is no longer the option of handing over data on paper or transferring data by a USB stick or anything like that. All of your data needs to be electronic and accessible at all times by everybody in the project. You know, I'm hoping we don't go into another lockdown, but we ultimately need to work now as if we might one day just need to go home and not come back to the office for a while. And therefore, all of that data needs to be online and accessible, whether that be online cost forms, spreadsheets, databases, meeting recordings, you name it, it should be online and it should be accessible. Further, metadata alone will not future-proof your data. It might be incredibly useful, and it is, and you should use it, but you also need to think about what format your data is being made available in. So for example, is it machine readable? Is it in a proprietary format or not? And if so, then it should really be exported out to an accessible format as well. So a pro tip given at one of our events was that it is worth capturing your data in text files as well to ensure that this data remains usable and readable, even if somehow the formatting is lost or the proprietary format it's in, you lose the capacity to open those specific data files. So this is really important when submitting data alongside a publication or if you're submitting it to a repository. So these considerations are not something that can just be thought about at the end of the project anymore. Not that they ever should have been, but ultimately it's now even more obvious and important that projects need up-to-date data management plans and that your data needs to be considered across the entire project lifecycle. The same data management tools might not suit every project, so it is really important to do your research and to use tools that suit the research area and strengths of your team. But remember to factor the costs into the plans for any research project. So this might be for specialist software, for data minimization or data anonymization tools, depending on your project, or it could be a staffing cost for the time associated with preparing your data for publication. Ultimately, we really forever, but will have left us with some better practices and the ability to understand what information does and doesn't need to be kept and shared moving forward. Now, we also learned a hell of a lot of semantic web lessons. So the first lesson is reuse where possible and practical. There are loads of ontologies out there. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be one that covers what you're looking for, but it is worth checking to see if one exists, or if one exists that partially covers what you want, in which case it's potentially worth making use of that and building on it, like the guys from Seed have done. Or you can use multiple ontologies depending on your use case. And it's also worth noting that a lot of effort has gone into creating ontology design patterns. So if you are going to make one from scratch, have a look at these, familiarize yourself, and don't reinvent the wheel. If there's a pattern that works for your criteria, use it. The second lesson is don't forget your standards. So just because RDF is a data standard in itself, doesn't mean it doesn't come with standards of its own. So there are initiatives such as the Obro Foundry that work computer science saying, I can do it better, I'm just going to go my own way. And then you forget that there are already things out there that can help you, even if it's not exactly what you thought you were looking for. So there are lots of existing taxonomies and schemas. They might not necessarily be in a semantic form, but that doesn't mean they don't exist for your domain. So in addition to seeing if there are ontologies that already exist, what you want to create, look for existing taxonomies and schemas, because many domains already have quite specific ways of describing things that they've already defined. They've defined the hierarchies, they've defined the descriptions, and it's worth using those, or at least considering them in your development. So thirdly, think about why you are making your ontology and what your end use case is. So are you making it to mark up a specific data set? In which case, chances are you are probably going to need to at least custom build some of it yourself. Are you creating it as a domain standard? And are you actually going to trial it, marking up your data? So there's not necessarily an issue if you're not, but you do need to think really carefully about how people would use it, if it's viable for use, and you need to test it, even if you aren't specifically using it yourself. Too many projects end at the ontology, and you think, well, where is it and how can I use it? And have you thought this through? So you need to think about the entire project lifecycle. It's also really important to modularize your ontologies. So it can be tempting just to make a giant ontology of everything, but that's really not ideal, especially if it encompasses different domains or subdomains of information. Chunking them down into smaller ontologies of related terms means it's much easier for those smaller ontologies to be reused in the future, and for only specific bits to be reused in other projects where relevant. The fifth lesson is you need to play to OWL's strengths. Ontologies are great tools, work particularly well with numerical based classifications. There is a level of being able to add basic numerical restrictions to classes, but it's quite simplistic. And if you're looking to perform some more complex maths on your data, I wouldn't necessarily advise doing it in your ontology. Now, this doesn't mean you can't still use semantic web technologies effectively. It might just be that you have a linked data set, you query it, and then you have your complex calculations in a separate algorithm, depending on how your system works. But trying to incorporate all of this logic into your ontology design isn't always feasible. Now, I won't go into specific details now about this, as we've probably already done information overload and we might be running a bit late on time, but there is also a newest semantic web standard I wanted to mention called SHACL, stands for Shapes and Constraints Language, and this does address some of the issues of OWL and provide some more comprehensive ways of modeling your data. There's also thinking about what you want your data to look like and what you want to do with it. So are you looking to link your data set to others so you can query across multiple data sets, for example? If so, then I imagine you would want to mark up the whole thing in RDF. Or are you just looking to add some richer metadata, in which case perhaps annotation would be better? Or perhaps producing some RDF as a separate metadata layer without marking up all the data underneath. It really just depends on your data and your use cases. So this thinking about what you want your data to look like at the end is also very important, because if you're planning to fully mark up a data set and convert that entire thing into triples, you want to know what those triples should look like before you create your ontology, or at least before you finalize your ontology, because once you start converting your data into a linked data format, you might find that it doesn't always pan out as you expect. So you also need to think about how to handle certain aspects of your data. So what if there's missing data? How are you going to deal with that? And how are you planning to convert your data? So again, a lot of projects finish at the ontology without consideration of how that ontology is actually going to be used to convert your, whether it's structured or free-form data, into a linked data set. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in this conversion process. So there is a mapping language called R2RML, which enables you to convert a database or a CSV file into linked data. But this doesn't work great if you have missing data. Unfortunately, with the nature of this mapping language, there's the expectation that you will always have a value to be converted, which we know with data sets isn't always the case. There are also some libraries that provide a level of flexibility around conversion and try and do some of it for you, but unfortunately they still don't work that well, and they still don't work very effectively if you have empty cells. Although they will try and automate some of the process for you, so that's things like linked open data are fine and these called web karma, but ultimately none of them really just help you do it in a manageable way if you've got a difficult, slightly sparse data set. You could also go old school and write a bash script, which is what would require you to have the appropriate expertise, and it's not super user-friendly across the project if you're working with people who wouldn't necessarily be able to understand that. But ultimately, this conversion process can be quite time-consuming and tricky, and you need to think about it in advance. A lot of these points boil down to one of our key advice lessons that came out of Failed It to Nailed It. Think about things early. think about all of them at the start of your project, as otherwise trying to change them midway down the line or at the end just isn't feasible. We also need to remember our old friend, garbage in and garbage out. If your data set is messy and inconsistent, then just blanket converting it into linked data isn't going to fix it, unless through that conversion, you're going to actually iron out some of those inconsistent issues. One of the really big issues of data lies in our collection process, and there are loads of data sets out there with missing data or data sets that are inconsistent. They use inconsistent units, inconsistent schemas, or they just don't plain make sense. And all of this needs to be addressed as well. It's also important to remember that fair is a 4-letter word. Yes, the I for interoperable is really important, but there is no point in having beautiful semantic data if no one can find it or access it or reuse it.
So where do we go from here? Moving forward, there is a lot of action that needs to be taken both on an individual but also on a collective scale. We all need to make an effort to improve both the digitization of the scientific research and managing our digital data. A really important aspect is the education of researchers about the importance of better digitization and the benefits that can be gained from it, and giving them an awareness of the solutions and initiatives that are available to them. Getting researchers on board is a key driver towards better digital data, especially as that is where the domain expertise lies. To facilitate this, it's also important that they are provided with the appropriate tools to help them do this. We also need to be digitizing at source more frequently when we can, which is something that the digital notation tools and the connected lab environments will help with, and ensuring that our digital data is in an interoperable, machine-readable format so that we can work with it more easily and make new scientific discoveries. However, we do need to have better confidence in the digital data, and that will come from better described data, which should be facilitated by these improved systems. For our work personally, we are planning to continue work on all our different projects as these feed into the overall digital research landscape. We're looking to enhance our smart lab with further integrations and functionality across the board, and we will be continuing work on different aspects of using the semantic web technologies with ELNs, including some work to improve the methods of creating and converting data into linked data, as Sammy mentioned earlier. As part of our facility activities, we're also looking at the wider research infrastructure across the UK and how abilities. We're continuing work on data capture. We're planning a trial of hybrid notebook products and evaluation of the performance across a range of different research-based situations. And our colleagues are continuing their work on automating the digitization process for existing research. We're also bringing back our Failed It to Nailed It series as part of our education and awareness activities. So our first installment focused on educating researchers about data sharing and data management in a more informational format. But the second installment is instead aiming to upskill researchers in the practical methods of dealing with data, including creating semantic data, accessing different types of data sources through a variety of methods, and how to visualize and analyze different types of data. We're currently planning a diverse and engaging set of events for this. And finally, just to round up, we've included some of the references for our papers that we have published on our work. And if you're interested in any of these areas, then you can also follow us on ResearchGate or Google Scholar, and you'll get updates on any of our newest publications. So thanks so much for listening. We appreciate that that has been quite a whirlwind tour across a variety of different topics, but I'm happy to take questions. I think we have a discussion session now. So yeah, if you have any questions, we're happy to take those.